What's up, guys? How are we doing today? Welcome to number 60 down to 51. This is part 5 on the Great Jazz Countdown series, the Battle of the Saxes. I gotta say, I'm really gleaning a lot of information here, learning a lot as I go. A good teacher needs to stay ahead of his students, and I guess I'm trying to do my best. It's just crazy. One of the other real things I'm learning here is the percentage of black guys who ended up joining the army in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was high. High compared to what the white cats were doing. You know, and white cats served, trust, absolutely. But especially leading up to the war, everybody was kind of getting in. But once you get into the 40s, in the late 40s, 50s, it's a black youth. Seems like your options are a lot less to be offered. Army, Navy was a good, career path. Anyway, let's dig in right away. Number 60, a guy by the name of Bill Leslie. And I want to drive something home again, real quick. That once we get past number 40 in this list, there's not a lot separating a lot of these guys in terms of popularity, influence. Some of them are more regional than others. You could rearrange these last 60 guys infinite ways, depending on who you talk to. And so I just want to remember that some of it was just me trying to mix up the eras, not having all avant-garde guys and then like all the unknown blues swing guys. I wanted it to be kind of mixed, these last 60 guys on the list. So it's just mixed somewhat by just a variety of guys. Some of it's filed by how broad a scope and impact and how many records they made. There's a lot of different things. But again, you have a record as a leader on the American great jazz labels in the 50s and 60s, going back to the 40s. Did you have stuff that came out on the Savoys, Bethlehems, Prestige, Blue Notes, Pacifics, all these great labels? Were you in that group? And that kind of gets you on the list for the most part. And then from there, it's like, how listenable and enjoyable are you for the masses? Like my beer reference I explained. Is it something that everybody can drink? That's going to bring you up some. Is it something that's very an acquired taste? That's going to knock you down some. But again, 40 through 60 is very interchangeable. And don't get hung up on the rankings of these last 60 guys. Let's more just learn about them and see what it has to tell us and teach us. The white guys came very much through Stan Kenton, Woody Herman, some Benny Goodman, but mostly those later two big bands. They were really influential and produced a lot of white cats. A lot of the white cats seem to use jazz as almost a stepping stone. They were really into it, and we dug this black music, and we played. But now I got a family to feed. I'm gonna go work for a Hollywood studio, play for a television big band. A lot of the white cats left jazz behind. With the black guys, you either stay with jazz, you pass away early, or you become a teacher. That seems to be the limit to the lot. Or you went to Europe. And in Europe, you were actually treated like a human being, given respect, had streets named after you, designed buildings. Like, it's insane. It's insane how America has treated these artists. But I'm guessing Egypt never found Moses a great hero either. And see what I'm saying? That's where this music places us. It's biblical in its context. These guys are doing something that's for freedom. Fuck the freedom of waving a flag. The freedom of fighting for freedom through art. Man, that's a whole lot realer. A brand of freedom. Freedom when you don't have freedom means something. Ask the average American to describe what freedom even means. They don't know. There's no consensus to the definition of what that is about. And when you get to the root of what freedom really means, the freedom that we celebrate and we fight for is the freedom for the elite, the economic giants to operate with as little inhibition as possible from hindering government and oversight. And so while we claim we love freedom, freedom's our thing, let's fight for freedom, what we're really fighting for is the freedom for the rich to take resources and profit from them, to make sure the public and the general population has no claim to that. It's freedom. We got here first. Too bad. That's what freedom looks like. You voted for it. We have the freedom to control other republics' politics and governments and economics. That's freedom. You fought for it. You wave the flag every day. Freedom. Don't put your government on you, you said. Don't put it on me either. Don't pay taxes? That's freedom. I'm a monster, huge corporation. I'm going to locate my headquarters in Dubai. Still going to operate and sell in America, but I ain't going to pay taxes. That's freedom. What does freedom define outside from that? The illusion that most people in the world can't write what they want to write, watch what they want. I'm not saying there's not political control, but if you don't think American television is controlled, and the message that you're receiving isn't shaped and shifted to fit an economic agenda, you ain't been overseas. You ain't watched British, any other television. You have never read a foreign paper. The American view from left to right is a very narrow scope of the entire global political spectrum. So this amazing divide that we think is so great is really mid-right of center to somewhat right of center. That's the American political scope. There's no center. There's no right. There's no far right. There's no far left. Americans this. And we fight over this huge little slice of the pie when the whole spectrum is like that. We're here from left to right. And we're stuck in this deadlock. It's an incredibly complex machine that has us so divided that we can't function. And they got two sides so outraged over social issues that the political economic aspect of what politics are supposed to govern just remains status quo, which is what they want. No meddle. Don't interfere with what we're doing. Fight over this. Immigration. Fight over race. Fight over guns. Fight over abortion. Yeah. Be up. Yeah. Oh, here's something on media. Watch that. Oh, you're so mad. This is great. You're so pissed off. And liberals are just as guilty as conservatives. But, I'm so pissed off. But you're never mad at the right people. There's a lot of heavy metal bands that were mad about a lot of things. Rage Against the Machine knew what they was mad about. That sure changes something, don't it? Bill Leslie. Big fan. He's a bluesy, gutsy guy. Not a ton of information on him out there. But I love this record. Some Coleman Hawkins in that. Some Ben Webster. He plays with Thornell Schwartz on this and on Thornell Schwartz's record. This one's called Digging the Chicks. And you can dig some chicks to this music. Ain't no question about that. This is chick digging music. Both these records, this one took me a while to track down, believe it or not. This one I found in Chicago. And you can actually find Argo chess records in Chicago relatively easier compared to anywhere else in the country, being a Chicago-based label. And there's just so many low-income housings that get emptied out. And the contractor says, oh, here's a box of records. I'll take them down to Reckless, get $10 for it. You know? And then Reckless, being the cool store that they are, plug, the longer something sits on their shelves, the more they start marking it down. And so if you're ever looking for in between the crack artists, stuff that doesn't be grabbed up right away, there's stuff that gets marked down to $2-3 that you're like, oh shit, this is $40 online. What am I gonna do? But Bill Leslie, he's like I said, he's a bluesy player. He's got just some soul to him. If I recall, is it this record? One of these records was Tommy Flanagan and Ben Tucker and Art Taylor, which is a pretty serious lineup. Tommy Flanagan, Ben Tucker, and Arthur Taylor. Recorded in '62 at Van Gelder's, Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. So Argo, Emerson, VJ, a lot of those guys, even though they were Chicago-based labels, often had their sessions recorded in New York, in part so you could cherry pick Tommy Flanagan, Ben Tucker, and Arthur Taylor. It's not a bad reason, you know. Again, that's also a great session. Even though it's billed to Thornell, they kind of work together quite a bit. Bill Leslie actually kind of becomes known for being with Louis Jordan's group. And he ends up playing with Louis Jordan's band for 15, 20 years. They play at the old Riviera, the old Sands in Vegas, the old Thunderbird. He was capable of playing bebop, straight ahead, a very harmonic player. Born in 1925 in Media, Pennsylvania, which I think is near Philadelphia. And he was a tenorman, and he picks up the tenor at age 12, and he joins the Army. And that's one of the other things I've really learned in this series, 50 in now, is a lot more black cats got in the Army than the white cats, man. White cats kind of got you, you got a bit of a wiggle in your eye there, wink wink. Yeah, you can stay home. I know you're going to college, I know you have a jazz band. And it's not to say white cats didn't serve, but doesn't seem like the proportions are quite even, especially once we start getting after the war, when things start to change. Number 59, a guy I've loved for a long time. He probably should be a little lower on the list. And now that I'm learning all the stuff I'm learning, same with Bill Leslie probably, but I love both these guys, so part of it's always going to be how much I enjoy them, how much I listen to them, and there's even going to be a certain dynamic to this of how much am I listening to you nowadays. And maybe that's not the fairest judgment, but I've been into these guys right now, so I'm gonna put them up a little higher. And remember, 50 through 45 through 100, you can mix these up how you want. I'm not gonna be mad. You know, refile them all how you want. I think once we get past 40, there's more of an established hierarchy there for sure. But a lot of these guys, I'm learning their backgrounds as I'm kind of doing this and going, oh, this guy should be higher. Oh, this guy should be a little lower. Same with the white cats. Once you got past 20 there, I was like learning a lot, and I was surprised by some of the pedigrees I learned on the white guys. You know, how few of them were anonymous players that just came from some local high school bands, got a recording contract. They all came from those big bands. They were all known entities. It's crazy how obscure they've all become. Leo Parker, he is April 18, 1925, born in D.C. He's the baritone player, probably one of the preeminent black baritone players. There's not a lot of them for some reason. Cecil Payne, there's another one I hadn't seen. And a lot of guys will mix baritone in, but he's a primary baritone player. He learned alto in school, but he does switch to the baritone. He plays on a recording with Coleman Hawkins in 1945. One of those early kind of modern advancements by Coleman Hawkins. He ends up playing the bands with Billy Eckstein's band from 45 to 46 or so, or about, and he becomes one of the unholy four. The four brothers were the White Cats in the Herman group, you know, the Getzes, the Alcones. This was the unholy four in Billy Eckstein's group, and it consists of Dexter Gordon, Gene Ammons, Sonny Stitt, and Leo Parker. And Parker is the most anonymous of those four, being the baritone guy. That's part of that. But think of that little rhythm, like that horn sax section. Stitt, Ammons, Dexter, Leo Parker. Yes, yeah, I want some, please. Can I have some of that? And what's sad is that Eckstein's recordings from those eras never really reflect what the band was doing live, from what I understand. I've seen a little footage of the live band, and it was a bebop-inspired big band. They were doing some crazy things. The recordings are much more commercial and much more within the lines. And if there's a great recording of the Billy Eckstein band with some of these great beboppers in it, someone tell me. I know Eckstein's Savoy stuff primarily, which seems to be where he was a lot of that time as a leader, as a recorder. And he's at Mercury for a long time as well, but that's after this era. So I'm curious as to where recordings are of these great groups that reflect what they were doing on stage when you saw them. Because I've heard the Eckstein group, when you saw them in the mid-40s, was electrifying. Blakey was in the band. Like, I heard it was just insane. Anyways, part of the Unholy Four. And he joins Dizzy on 52nd Street in 1952. He joined Dizzy on 52nd Street in 1946. And so he's playing with Dizzy pretty much as bebop started to really become a thing. Although when you saw Dizzy on 52nd Street versus at Minton's, they were probably playing a little bit more carefully on 52nd Street. But he ends up joining the Illinois Jackette, 4748 on 52nd Street. And there's that Illinois Jackette name again. He's such a giant that gets really very little of the credit he deserves. He also plays with Fats Navarro, J.J. Johnson, Teddy Edwards. He's playing with Wardell Gray and a guy by the name of Charles Thompson, who he has a kind of a hit with at some point. He makes a comeback in 62, and he records a couple of records at Blue Note 61. These Blue Note records, and they're actually great records. This one's 4087, so that probably puts it 1960, and this one's 4095, and this one wasn't issued in America at the time, and it was issued later in Japan, I believe, and it's probably going to get a Tone Poet issue at some point. At least the Japanese gave it a proper cover, not some of that crap that came out in the 80s. I love both these records. They're full of guts and gravy. You know, you could sop them up with the biscuits. Rich baritone, just marvelous sound. I can't tell you enough how much I've enjoyed both these Leo Parker records over the last 10 years. And I've probably inflated his place some because I love him a lot. But that's going to happen. He dies in 1962. He had a bad drug habit. And so as he's recording for Blue Note, he's trying to struggling through that. And it's partly why he was off the scene for a while in the late 50s. So he makes his comeback, records for Blue Note, and he dies of a heart attack in 62. And whether that heart attack was brought on by complications from heroin addiction, it didn't say. It didn't say. I gotta grab something, I'll be right back. Next guy we're gonna talk about is George Braith. I just picked up an old copy of this. So I wanted to grab it because I didn't have it in my stack yet. Braith is an interesting character. I haven't even cleaned this or nothing, so hopefully it sounds fine. But George Braith was born 1926, June 26, 1939, in New York City. He's a multiple horn player like Roland Kirk. He actually invents an instrument that he called the Braithophone, which was a straight sax and a soprano sax that he links together, and he's able to kind of play them simultaneously. He's got a lot of soul jazz, Grant Green company kind of guy. His records on Blue Note are really outstanding. I had this one, of course, but this is like a budget or reissue of it. These two are both original pressings as well. This one's got a bit of a warp to it, but it actually plays fine. Extension, we're talking 4171, 4161, and 4148. So these come after the Leo Parker records. And by this time it's 62, 63. Soul jazz is coming to the fore at Prestige, and definitely Blue Note's going to have their share of it. He is a part of the jazz mural on the wall in the 72nd Street subway station in New York City. So if you're down there, you should look for George Braith. He plays some with a guy by the name of John Patton, a great organ player, at the Blue Note label. He also makes a couple of records for Prestige, which I don't have, that came out in 67, 68. which is where my collection starts thinning out. I'd like to find those prestige George Braith records. It's a long list of stuff that I still want to find, you know. And my collection's going to start moving more into the 70s and 80s as I continue to do the Jazz Shepherd thing, because I just need to know as much as I can to stay on top of what I'm doing. So that's George Braith. Like I said, I've always enjoyed all three of his Blue Notes. They're pretty important parts of the Blue Note discography. He certainly borrows some from the Roland Kirk conception, but I feel like he's got his own sound and plays in his own way. Next guy I want to talk about is a guy who I loved for a long time, and that's Pharaoh Saunders. And Pharaoh, of course, will be known to a lot of jazz fans because he works in John Coltrane's band, 65, 66, 67. You know, he's with Coltrane for a number of important avant-garde free jazz sessions. Had some impact on Coltrane, but undoubtedly Coltrane had a lot of impact on him. And Albert Ayler once said that Train was the father, Pharaoh was the son, and he was the Holy Ghost. And that kind of sums it up in some ways. Albert Ayler, sadly, I don't have any records by him. His stuff on ESP comes out in the 60s. I never bought it. I've seen it in new copies that were all kind of expensive. And as I was kind of discovering him, I was kind of falling out of avant-garde. I never paid the money for him. And then his Impulse stuff kind of comes later. And I never really bought 70s Impulses that much. I have a few Pharaoh, a few Coltrane 70s Impulse, but I've never really strayed into the Impulse era. I love that bowed bass there. But Ayler definitely is worthy of a mention. He's just a guy that, like I said, I've never really dove into much because I was getting out of the avant-garde at that point. Pharaoh is a leader of the spiritual jazz movement. He works with Coltrane's wife, Alice Coltrane, for a long time. I have about 5 or 6 of Pharaoh's Impulse records here, and his records often have very meditative moments like this that are gorgeous, cerebral, intellectual, global kind of sounds. And there's a spiritual kind of presence to them. But they usually descend into some pretty heavy cacophony at some point. And it's the cacophony that my older man ears has more of a difficult time spending much time visiting anymore. I respect him a lot. I enjoyed him a lot during my LSD days, you know, sitting back and thinking about the cosmos. It's pretty deep stuff. And unlike Shep, unlike Ayler, unlike Marion Brown, he wasn't super educated in terms of secondary post-education and fancy degrees. He was more of a guy from the streets and learned his way through the clubs. And he did play fairly traditional early on in his career. His first name is Pharaoh, which becomes Pharaoh pretty easily. October 13, 1940. While with Coltrane, they kind of both dive into that overblowing sound where the horn will squawk, and you can sometimes get it to have a harmonic element to it. Other times it can be just straight shrieking. I think it's best done tastefully and in limited amounts, and 25 minutes of that horn, I can't do it anymore. I just can't. If you're 18 and want to shock your roommates, you should do it, play it, love it, you know. But it is on the edges, and that's partly why he's down in 57 on my list now, because this is music for a certain crowd, not the masses. This is a triple imperial stout, super vinous, super molassy, super body, really complex, hot, bitter finish. It's not beginner music. It's pretty intense. Again, he's a big thing with Coltrane. Ornette Coleman actually calls him the best tenor player in the world. Coming from a guy who never really played the blues a whole lot, I'm going to leave it at that. He's from the Little Rock area, which became his nickname, Little Rock. And he goes to the Bay Area in '59, kind of cuts his chops out there, where he actually meets John Coltrane in the Bay Area. But then he goes to New York in '61 and starts having flirtations with Coltrane's groups by '64, and by '65 he's in the fold. And they make some pretty incredible but cacophonous records, you know, from Om to Kula Se Mama. There's just it's meditation. There's some pretty deep stuff, and like I said, it's meant for fighting the demons of death at the door. How am I going to battle my own mortality? This music's for that. And so that potentially leaves the door open for me coming back to it someday. Pharaoh Saunders' Karma. His first few I like more than his later ones. Jewels of Thought. Themby. He plays a lot of different instruments too, like little flutes and kind of world sounds at times. Black Unity. This is 219 on Impulse, so really late. This is Live at the East, much later on Impulse. Oh, I think it's recorded earlier than that, though. But Pharaoh definitely was embracing that whole world look and sound and feel that really you first get the first glimpses of with guys like Yusuf Lateef. You know, Yusuf Lateef is doing that dissonant kind of world Arabic sound at times, but then resolving it back to melody and groove, and the hard bop that he was part of that school. But Coltrane and Pharaoh and Archie, these guys all push it out to a whole new dimension. And often when they go out, once they go through that door, they're completely capable of not coming back through the door. So that wraps up Pharaoh. If that's your thing, great. You know, because it was my thing for a long time. I'm down. I get it. It's fantastic. But also, don't feel, as a jazz beginner, you have to like this stuff. And there's a whole lot of jazz out there that's a lot easier to like than Pharaoh Saunders. You know, it's okay to be like, it's not for me. You know, just as okay as it is to say, I love it, it's the best thing ever. Because it belongs in its place. And that's where it should stay, in its place. A part of the movement that happened late towards the dying stages of the jazz movement, and the avant-garde in some ways contributes to jazz's demise. It certainly didn't help keep it alive. Number 56, James Clay. I'm a big fan of James Clay. He's also a Texas tenorman. It's a big line of bluesy, gutsy, large tone players that have quite an impact on jazz and its trajectory towards rhythm and blues. You know, the gap from Jacquette and David Newman and James Clay to Louis Jordan and Earl Bostic and Ray Charles. It's the lineage. You can feel where those branches are going, you know. And the Texas Tenormans are part of that movement towards T-Bone Walker, towards Junior Walker, you know. Rhythm and blues comes from jazz, you know, and the blues, obviously. James Clay was born September 8th, 1935 in Dallas, Texas. He ends up jamming in school and playing around with Booker Ervin at that time, who was also a Texas tenorman, who's coming up in our list shortly. He moves to LA, California, plays with Red Mitchell and Lawrence Marble. And they do a record on Contemporary. That's a really great record, actually. He's got a hard bop sound. He plays sax and the flute. He swings hard. He's got some soul jazz elements to him at times, but he's more modern than a traditional soul jazz cat. And I think he's playing the flute right here. Yeah, it's gorgeous, swinging. David Fathead Newman, of course, kind of brings him to the foreground of Ray Charles' fame. So here he's doing the favor for James Clay. These two records on Riverside are outstanding records. Modern, complex, with blues and swing guts to them. Just really unheralded gems of the Riverside discography. Number 327, number 349, puts them like 61, 62 probably. Just great stuff. He actually is in the Army in 1959. He gets out, goes to New York, records these sides for Keith News and Bill Grau at Riverside. He ends up doing some side work with guys like Wes Montgomery, moving along. Frank Morgan, Gene Norman Presents record, he's on that. David Newman, of course, he returns the favor and does some of his stuff. He plays with Hank Crawford. So that whole soul, jazz, blues, R&B, but his two records are more than that. You know, they're really great modern, great to listen to, accessible Texas tenor jazz. So James Clay is a guy I recommend pretty highly. And he's a guy you can put on James Clay, read the newspaper while your wife's making your omelet, and she won't be like, put some mouse on? How was the talk radio? You know, it's gonna give you some fuel without making everybody else want to leave the room. And that's the great balancing act, you know? Being inventive, fun, creative, exploratory, but yet remaining accessible. And it's not an easy line to walk. If it was, there'd be a lot more Beatles, you know? Being the Beatles ain't easy. Moving along to number 55 on my list. A great by the name of Curtis Amy, who's a black cat, who's a West Coast cool cat. And he actually isn't from the West Coast originally. He originally hails from, I believe, Texas it was, yeah, Houston. But he's not really considered a Texas tenorman. He's more of considered a West Coast cool guy. He was born October 11, 1929, in the Houston area. He joins the Army, of course, picks up the tenor. He goes to Kentucky State College, plays in local clubs in the Kentucky area, and then he decides eventually to move to LA in the 50s. He signs with Pacific Jazz Records, and he makes some great records here at Riverside. At Pacific. The one I'm playing is outstanding, with the great Paul Bryant on the organ. And this was a staple of my jazz DJ sets at the Bread Cow in Minneapolis. Like, you can play this any Saturday morning. People eating their morning eggs and biscuits, and they'd be like, oh, loving it. Feet are tapping. They don't even know what they're hearing. It just feels that cool, because it is that cool. This is early on the PJ9, where they restarted the sequence at number 1 about 1960. So this is Curtis Amy and Paul Bryant again. It's called The Blues Message. Outstanding. The one we're listening to is like number 26, shortly after. And this one's number 19, so it comes in between there. Groove and Blues. And I honestly can tell you, any one of these 3 records on Pacific are worthy of being in any collection. They are just that gutsy blues-driven, swing-driven, fun. To me, it's as good as organ jazz gets, because it's not necessarily the virtuosity of a Jimmy Smith record. When you listen to Jimmy Smith, there's going to be some heavy grooves and blues going on, but Jimmy's also breaking the rules of the organ every time he plays. He's like, I'm going to do something different now. And you're like, oh, what the fuck did you just do? This isn't about that. This is more about the squint face, the pocket full of funk face. I'm in church with a tambourine, some potato salad face. Love these records. Staples of my DJ sets, all 3 of them. This comes out on Verve, probably like 67, 68. A record I saw a lot for years before I bought it, because I didn't know much about them when I was a young collector, obviously. You see this record, it's fun. It's got a great little group on it as well. He actually records with Dizzy for a while in '56. Mid-'60s, he becomes director of the Ray Charles Band, probably taking over for Hank Crawford. He's a crossover star. He's playing on pop, R&B, and rock records with The Doors, with Carole King, Lou Rawls, Smokey Robinson, Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell. Like, that's across the board where his services are being utilized. And that shows you kind of where his trajectory was headed. He plays with Gerald Wilson out west from '65 to '66, who was a great arranger himself on the West Coast. Curtis Amy is a real giant of soul, jazz, West Coast cool jazz, organ swing sound. You should dig him. Number 54. And I can honestly tell you that Arnett Cobb knows the blues. Arnett Cobb's a Texas tenorman as well. And the Texas tenor school is just a fascinating substrata of the saxophone. And I wanted to do a separate section on the Texas tenorman initially, but what I didn't want to do was relegate some of these guys out of their place in the overall picture. Guys like Illinois Jack Cat, I don't want them to be number one of just the Texas tenor section. I want them to be highly highlighted in the overall arch of the saxophone. So I decided against doing the Texas tenors separate for that reason. Arnett Cobb makes a great string of records at the Prestige label. Just outstanding stuff. Somewhat in the Gene Ammons, Illinois Jack Cat vein, soul, jazz, Texas tenor blues, Famous Dave's barbecue sauce dripping down your Kansas City ribs. Like, it's just, you can smell the cattle. It comes from Texas. You know, there's some ranch hands eating bacon and beans going, sure like us some Arnett Cobb. They heard it enough in the juke joints. They got it. It's soaked in the blues. It's soaked in feel. And Arnett Cobb is a storyteller like a Lester Young. And let me tell you, she was fine. See, the blues talks about sex and inflects on sex and reflects on sex because that's the euphoria. That's the heaven on earth. That's the safety. That's the one tangible luxury that a blues man counts on. Jelly roll. I don't got a mansion on the hill. I don't got political voice. I can't even eat and drink and sleep in most establishments. I got jelly roll. There's a reason why so much of the blues and jazz is so soaked in sexuality. It's what we got to look forward to. It's the good in a world full of hurt, in a world full of pain. And I can't always physically comment on that pain. So I'm going to comment on how I forget that pain, which is commenting on the pain. You know what I mean? To be so focused on the up and down of the sensual, sexual nature tells you about how little they want to think about some of the other things going on in their daily routine. And that's where the avant-garde kind of drifts away from that. It wants to think, because it's moved into an era where the amount of pain is diminished enough where intellectualism can come to the fore. And I can start thinking on broader things, like how can I change the music and make it more me? So intellectualism and sexualism have separate roles to play. Sex was the great medication. And this early generation of cats, it's so ingrained in every muscle and tissue, and it's just an important aspect that never should be forgotten. It's why it swings like it does. In the early 40s, he plays with a guy by the name of Milt Larkin, who ends up having Illinois Jacquet, Cleanhead Vincent, and Wild Bill Davis in the lineup. All four are badasses. He plays with Lionel Hampton from 42 to 47, another Lionel Hampton connection. Hampton's kind of omnipresent in some ways here. His solo on Flying Home No. 2 with Lionel Hampton became legendary, and it earned him the nickname the Wild Man of the Tenor Sax because of that great solo on that. In the 70s and 80s, he's still playing and recording. But I'm going to show you now his streak of records here on Prestige. 71-51, 71-65. This is on the Moodsville label. Ballads by Cobb. Outstanding. Beautiful ballad player. Moving right along on it, Cobb 72-16. I like how in 7200 or so they go to that box logo. It tells you an era right there. Smooth Sailing 71-84. Arnett Cobb, More Party Time 71-75. Sizzlin' 72-27. One of the worst album covers in the Prestige discography, at least from that era. So these 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 Arnett Cobb records are all absolutely fantastic and can be had for pretty easy bucks. You know, you're not going to be charged an arm and a leg for Arnett Cobb records. 40, 50 bucks should get you a really good player. Bunky Green. Bunky Green's a guy I've been getting into more of late. He's number 53 on the list here. Born April 23rd, 1925. He's an alto player. He from the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. He ends up becoming a teacher. And like I've said, a black man post jazz is most often likely to become a teacher, a professor of music. Somehow stays connected to the music through that by teaching young kids. But they certainly don't get the showbiz endings that a lot of the white cats got. Bunky Green, like I said, was from Milwaukee. In New York City, he goes there in 1960. He ends up playing some with Charles Mingus, who impacts him a lot because of his diverse selection of notes and how he approaches space. So he's definitely impacted by Mingus. He was hired to replace Jackie McLean, which are fairly big shoes to fill. He goes back to Chicago in 63 or so. Ends up playing out the Argo label with Sonny Stitt. He plays with Louis Bellson, who was probably on Mercury at the time. He plays with Andrew Hill at a young age. Yusef Lateef. He's with Ira Sullivan. A lot of you guys are strong Chicago bloodlines. He's influenced by Parker initially, but he really kind of finds his own sound, and he ends up influencing younger cats like Steve Coleman and a guy by the name of Greg Osby, who I've heard some of Osby's stuff, very little Coleman stuff. He's ends up teaching at the Chicago State University from 72 to 89. Long time. And it influences generations of young kids. He records at VJ, he records at Argo, he records at the Vanguard label, and he's an important sideman to Fontella Bass for a long time as well. So he's somewhat in the soul, R&B blues vein, but he has a bit of his own brighter sound and a little more edge to him than just straight soul jazz. This is on Argo number 753. And he's got kind of a tongue-in-cheek attitude, flair to him that I really enjoy. Just kind of a spunky character. This is playing for keeps on Argo 766. Now it's Cadet because they had to lose the Argo name. This is 780, the Latinization of Bunky Green, 1965-66 probably. All three of these Bunky Green records are great. He has another one with Sonny Stitt that I'm a big fan of. I should have pulled it, but I forgot to. Something I meant to do. I really enjoy Bunky's stuff. He's got his own kind of sound to him. He kind of truly does. It's a guy that I think most cats should dig into. You know, I don't think anyone's gonna mind you playing Bunky Green at the coffee shop. You know, it's that kind of vein, fun stuff. Moving on to number 52 on the list, a guy by the name of Hank Crawford. And Hank is a giant. I'm a big fan of Hank Crawford's stuff. He's definitely more of a soul R&B crossover guy. He makes some pretty successful records at CTI, Kudu in the 70s that are very crossover jazz. And it's the kind of jazz that a black audience today knows and likes. They don't want to hear Monk or Miles. They want to hear Grover Washington, Hank Crawford, George Benson, Donald Byrd. That's the jazz that they think of as jazz. Today's 50, 60, 70-year-old black audiences. Traditional jazz isn't something that you get requested very often by a black audience. And that's more white kids, to be honest. Hank has a big discography here, and he's a great player. As you'll hear, he's born December 21, 1934 in Memphis. So he's part of that great Memphis lineage of musicians. And wherever you have a large black population, you're going to have a lot of black musicians coming out of it. It's just really it's really driven home the more biographies I do. Like I say, he's in the R&B, hip, hard bop, soul jazz vein. Early influences were Charlie Parker, Louis Jordan, Earl Bostic, and Johnny Hodges, which you can hear all those guys in his sound. 52, he records with B.B. King while in Memphis. B.B.'s still kind of an up-and-coming guy at that time as well. Hank is actually a nickname. His real name is Benny Ross Crawford, but he looked like a local sax player by the name of Hank something. I can't recall. And they nicknamed him Hank, and it stuck, Hank Crawford. And that's just what he went with going forward. And he meets Ray Charles. By 58, he's in Ray Charles' band playing baritone. And then he ends up becoming the director of the band, switching to alto. And he leads the band pretty much from 59 to 63. One of the great bands of all time in the R&B, blues, jazz, crossover vein is that Ray Charles Atlantic stuff from that era. And Ray kind of is the Eckstein Lionel Hampton to this generation. He's a guy that a lot of guys cut their teeth coming through. He's got a stage big enough where he's going to shine some light on you as a player and give you a career of your own, just like an Eckstein, just like a Lionel Hampton. Like Hampton took that light that Goodman gave him and passed it on to so many young kids. And Charles is doing that here as well, giving a lot of young black cats a chance to put a name out there, make a name for yourself, and build your own career. And as he's working with Charles at Atlantic, he ends up signing a deal with Atlantic. And from 1960 to 1970, he puts out a great string of records while still running Charles' group a lot of that time. This is more soul, number 1356. 1372 is The Soul Clinic. 1387, From the Heart. Double Cross is number 1503. We jumped ahead there a little bit. 1405 is The Soul of the Ballads. 1423, True Blue. Hank Crawford, Dig These Blues. This is number 1436. 1455 is Hank Crawford, After Hours. And then we got Hank Crawford, Mr. Blues, 1470, from the brief gatefold era of Atlantic. But a dozen, 12, 15 releases in this era simultaneously come on as gatefolds. And you don't know that until you have hundreds of Atlantic records. You're like, oh shit. They decided to go gatefold for a minute to try to compete with Verve and Impulse, and then decided, this isn't worth it. Costs too much. That wraps up my Hank Crawford discography. He's got a lot of stuff. Like I said, I mostly know his Atlantic stuff. I have a couple of his CTI records, Kudu records, but they're in the R&B room because I DJ with him sometimes. Crawford's an important cat, you know. And he definitely is more veining towards R&B, but he certainly has jazz chops in him. And like he comes from being influenced by guys like Charlie Parker. So certainly an influential guy and one worthy of mention. And then number 51 on my list today is Jerome Richardson. And he's a guy whose career as a leader is rather minimal. But his impact as a sideman is pretty universal. This is his record on New Jazz, 8205, which makes it the 4th or 5th release on the New Jazz Prestige label. Who's playing trombone there? Jimmy Cleveland. Those of you who watch me for any length of time have noticed that whenever I go, who's that on trombone? Ends up being Jimmy Cleveland 89% of the time. You know what I mean? Cleveland's such a dynamic player. Richardson is a fantastic multi-instrumentalist. I know him as well from flute as being a sax player. He goes back to being a member of some great Savoy sessions in the 40s and early 50s, where his name pops up in a lot of stuff. He's born in Oakland, California. Born October 25, 1920. He plays the tenor, the flute, the soprano, the alto, the baritone, the bass clarinet, the alto, flute, plus more. Right. He plays with Mingus. He plays with Lionel Hampton. He plays with Billy Eckstine. He plays with Thad Jones and Mel Lewis's group. He plays with Oliver Nelson, Kenny Burrell, Kenny Clark, Oscar Pettiford, Nat Adderley, Jimmy Cleveland, Sarah Vaughan, Hank Jones, Ernie Wilkins, Quincy Jones, and others. Many, many others. Into the 70s and the 80s. From 55 to 80, his list of side work, it's impressive, and it's all over the map. He appears on some rock stuff and some soul stuff and some, like, he's really a highly in demand guy. This record comes out on Verve 8729, so probably 1969, 68. It's a solid record as well. It's got some interesting players on it. Grady Tate, the great drummer, Buddy Lucas, Charles Rainey, Eric Gale's on some of this on guitar. Not the most common Verve record, but it's a solid session. He has another record on Prestige, which I don't have, and I'd like to get it at some point. I believe it's also on New Jazz. And there's probably about a dozen New Jazz titles I have not come across yet, for either for a good price or in decent condition. I want to plug them in eventually, but love this record. It's been I listen to it quite often, which in my collection that's hard to do, you know. But I've always enjoyed it. It's got a nice swing to it, a nice light feel. It's got some soul to it. You know, flute often doesn't give you a lot of gut, but he's got some guts behind his playing. And I noticed it on some of those Savoy tracks as well. So that's number 51. A guy that's really omnipresent in the music industry, but a really unheralded name is Jerome Richardson. You should dig him. You should check him out. You should love him. That wraps up this top 10. So it's a great 10. You know, and I'm enjoying learning with you guys on this one. You know, and it's probably almost going to be the need when we're done with this to look at these rankings and to reshape them some. But who knows? I think I also want to do a recap when we're done with all this and just summarize a lot of what we're seeing and learning in this whole process. I was talking with Ken McAuliffe yesterday about some of the things I'm grasping, and I've shared a lot of it here already, you know, but every time I do 10 more guys, I usually see one or two things like, oh wow, that's an interesting trend. That's interesting information. So much has been learned. Appreciate y'all for watching. Y'all be safe. Say goodbye.